For joining. I'll start that again. The recording in progress interrupted me. So, Iklanete, everyone. My name is Arielza Ekwe Deranger. I'm a member of the Attawapiskat Chipewyan First Nation, and I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. And you're joining us today for the first in a series of webinars that are going to explore the history of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. And really, we're going to be exploring why it's been so important for Indigenous peoples to be participating in these spaces and how we have been leading the discourse. Today, we are joined by some amazing speakers. We have with us Elder Frank Attawapiskat. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Attawapiskat, Andrea Carmen, Janine Yazzie, and Clayton Thomas Mueller, who have all been participants and leaders within these movement spaces over the last 20, 30, sometimes even more years. And some of us are new, some of us are, not been in this for a long time, but have been really active in advocating for the rights of our communities at the community level and the national level and the international level. Today's discussion will be approximately 60 minutes with some time for some Q&A from you folks that are joining us online. And we're really excited to be jumping into this really great conversation. Each speaker will introduce themselves a little bit more, but I'm going to start with a small presentation to walk us through what this whole process around the UNFCCC is and how it got started. So give me 1 second while I screen share for you all. So again, this is part 1 of our series, Indigenous Peoples of the UNFCCC, and I thank you so much for joining us all today. I'm going to skip this one. I didn't mean to put that one in there. I thought I had removed it. So first off, it's really good to sort of land us in the context of the fact that Indigenous peoples are everywhere on the planet. We exist in almost every country and continent, and we represent roughly 5% of the global population. And that is butting up around 400 million people worldwide. We represent over 5,000 distinct groups, and that means with our own languages, our own cultures, our own governance and laws, and we are in over 90 countries globally. Indigenous peoples occupy or use between 22 to 64% of the land surface. And the reason why that number is so drastic is that there's pretty common agreements on 22%, but there are people that say that we actually utilize up to 64% of the land surface. And that's a really important number to recognize within the context of this discussion, because when you look at urban settings or where most of settler society lives, urban centers actually only represent 3 to 4% of the land surface on the planet. And Indigenous peoples utilize a much broader spectrum of land, and that is because of our cultural relationships with the ecosystems and the places where we have come from. And what's even more stark as a contrast to the importance of Indigenous land and relationship is that 80% of the global biodiversity exists within recognized Indigenous lands and territories, and also 85% of the world's protected and conservation areas is within or adjacent to Indigenous lands and territories. This becomes a really critical, important fact to understand, that we are not simply something to be romanticized somewhere else, but we are a force that has been leading the stewardship and the management of the vital ecosystems of our planet since time immemorial. And that comes from our deep relationships. And these rights that Indigenous peoples have and that we have been advocating for within these processes of the UNFCCC are really stemming from the fact that we have unique rights. So I want folks to understand that Indigenous peoples have human rights. We all have human rights. The fundamental rights to our, individual rights and freedoms exists for us, but Indigenous peoples advocated for our unique rights to be recognized by the world. And that was advocated and fought for over 20 years of negotiations with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And one of the real reasons that was advocated for is that the UN Declaration of Human Rights was developed before many Indigenous communities were even recognized as peoples, meaning that those rights and freedoms for human rights were not actually even applicable to our own people. And the second piece was why is it so important is that Indigenous peoples see themselves as collective as opposed to individuals. Does that mean we don't have individual rights and freedoms? No, we absolutely have individual rights and freedoms, but we also have collective rights. And the last piece within the UN Declaration that's important to understand is that these rights are interrelated with the natural world, which you can read throughout the UN Declaration, which provides a really good understanding of the needs for the protection and preservation of Indigenous peoples, our rights, cultures, languages, governance, so on and so forth. But we're currently in this climate crisis that, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, extractivism have led us into this current crisis known as the climate crisis. And we have the global world advocating and looking for solutions for how we can reconcile this crisis that we are in that is largely man-made. And this journey, the first time the world started to come together to discuss climate change was in 1979 at the World Climate Conference. And this happened in Geneva to, look at what's going on. And it was at this time that it was, that common understanding that climate change was man-made was beginning to come to the surface. I also want to stress that many Indigenous peoples still were not invited and welcomed into these spaces at the time, because we were still dealing with, really adverse racism and discrimination in many countries, and we were not looked upon as being valuable to these contributions. Throughout the 80s and into the 90s, this story kept coming out. The report in 1987, Our Common Future, really looked at how we were going to move together. Newsweek, Discover, Time, everyone was talking about global climate change, and Indigenous peoples simultaneously were advocating for our own rights to be recognized, and our relationships with the natural world were there. But you can see within the common sort of forward-facing discourse, Indigenous peoples weren't really included. In 1988, the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program created what is now known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And Indigenous peoples were in a lot of these tables and bodies within the UN, but we weren't sitting at the front of these conversations still within the IPCC. But the point is that we were seeing this movement, this momentum moving towards the creation of international coordination and collaboration on addressing the climate crisis. A lot of this culminated in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit, where state leaders came together to really discuss climate change as a global issue. It was states were there. There was really impassioned testimony given by many folks around the need to address the global climate crisis. But there's a really unknown story that also happened at the same time. Prior to the Rio Summit, in the communities in Brazil, the Carioca Declaration was created in 1992 by Indigenous peoples, talking about our interrelationship with the natural world and our role as leaders in participating in this discourse. And we created these sort of outside summits, these sort of not counter summits, but parallel summits to what was happening inside. Because again, many Indigenous peoples were still not recognized as leaders, or as even many places as valuable contributing members to society. So this was a really big moment for our people, because the UN Secretariat looked at the Carioca Declaration and accepted it as part of the working documents of that meeting in Rio. Since then, the first conference of the parties, or the COP, which is the big international gatherings of the UNFCCC, began in 1995. And Indigenous peoples have been participating very, very, like every year it grows, the participation, and we've been advocating and pushing for our rights, and the recognition of our knowledge is critical to these structures and systems. Yet we still struggle to be sitting at the same table, but that doesn't mean that we have not made vast and important contributions to the discourse and the dialogue on moving away from looking at the climate as something separate from us that needs to be fixed, and really bringing in the discourse around climate as an issue that is a part of our entire being and our wellness, and a holistic approach that embodies what we've been advocating for within the within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, within many of the UN spaces where we're saying that our rights are interconnected with the land. I introduced myself as a member of the Attawapiskat Chippewa First Nation, and for our community, our traditional name is Kaitale Dene Sotlene, which means people of the willow and people of the land. It is impossible to separate our identities from where we come from. The chief of my nation once said that if they destroy our entire delta, then who are we as a people? If we are not people of the willow, then who are we? And it's really important to understand those deep relationships that have been forged over millennia of our relationships with those natural spaces to provide us with the guidance that we have had to safeguard and preserve the biodiversity that has nurtured our communities for millennia. And these are the things that we are bringing forward within these spaces. I wanted to sort of just end with a few little notes here that, Indigenous peoples have been advocating so much that our rights have become so recognized as critical in those relationships and the role that we've played in preserving the biodiversity, that within the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, it has within its decision text important references to Indigenous peoples' rights that can help drive change at the local level where it's most needed. And it's become one of the first international conventions since UNDRIP that affirms and recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples within its text and weave throughout. And so we really have to recognize that this didn't happen by accident. This was because of the strong advocacy and participation that our people have had since the beginning of the conversations in 1979. We have been there, even though we have been a small group of people. We have been loud and we have been advocating for what's best, not just for our communities, but what's best for the planet at large. I think I'm going to skip this video. It's a beautiful video from the COP. If we have time later, I'll show it, or I might share the link in the chat. And I just really want to end with the fact that we often look at climate change as something where we have to reconcile the GHGs in the atmosphere, which we do. But the reality is that we are out of balance. The Earth is out of balance, and we are out of balance with ourselves and Mother Earth. And in order to address the climate crisis, we must restore our relationships with Mother Earth and with each other, and address this imbalance in all aspects of our lives. We cannot simply be relegating the climate crisis to accounting for carbon in the atmosphere. We must be taking a holistic approach that includes human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And with that, I invite our incredible panelists to walk us through the history and why this has become such an important part of our work and advocacy of working towards that inclusion within these spaces, and what it means for us as Indigenous peoples to be continuing to drive forward progressive and important changes within these spaces. And I'd like to first start by asking our speakers just to go around and introduce themselves, where they're joining us from, and anything else you'd like to share with the folks that are listening today.
I'm Frank Attawapiskat. I'm Odawa from Michigan, and I'm joining from our traditional territory of Waganukksing, the land of the crooked tree, which is just south of the Mackinac Straits on the Lake Michigan shore.
Yes, I'm Chaniabo. I'm Andrea Carmen, Yaqui Nation, joining you from the beautiful and very warm Sonora Desert in southern Arizona, and also our territories in northern Mexico. I'm the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council. Thank you.
Yat She Janine Yazi and Chia from the Dene Nation, and I'm joining you all from Gallup, New Mexico. And I serve as Sustainable Development Programs Coordinator for International Indian Treaty Council.
Bonjour, Tanse, Zongi Benisi de Netish Nakas Kinutotem. Hi, everybody. My name's Clayton Thomas Mueller. I'm a Cree man from Pugatawagan Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory here in these lands that they call Canada. And I'm based, however, in the city of Winnipeg, which is literally the geographic center of Turtle Island, or as we Winnipeggers like to call it, the center of the universe. And I'm really happy to be here, though, and very honored to be on a panel with all these amazing human beings.
So sorry, I couldn't find my mute button there. The wonders of technology and how it sometimes makes everything great and sometimes makes things challenging. I just want to thank you all for joining us here as we take this journey into understanding the importance of Indigenous peoples at the UNFCCC. The reason why we're having this conversation as well is because this November, the world leaders and Indigenous peoples and civil society are once again mobilizing to meet in Glasgow, Scotland this November for the COP26. So COP26 is the Conference of the Parties, and 26 represents the year in which they had. So this is the 26th COP. So you can imagine that those that have been involved in this since Rio in 1992 or the first COP in 1995 have a lot of rich history to share. And there's a lot of rich experiences of Indigenous peoples' participation, both inside the forums and on the outside. And really understanding why we've been doing this is critical as we move up to the COP26 in Scotland this November. So with that, I would really like us to get started. And I'd like to start with Elder Frank to lead us into really your own story and journey on why you think this is critical and important for Indigenous peoples to be participating in these forums, and your own experience on how you've seen the importance of Indigenous peoples within these spaces.
Well, Miigwech, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. I think as I think about what's going on, I think about what my first experience at a COP was in Paris. And this, I'd been paying attention to climate change issues for long before that, but I hadn't had the opportunity to be involved with the these international meetings. Leading up to that COP in Paris was something really important that happened. And that is we went and had all around the world, and particularly around North America, we did meetings and surveys, and we worked with the people. Why? Because it's the voice of the people that we speak for when we're there at these meetings. And it's not just those of us who attend the meeting who are speaking our own minds, but we're speaking for and doing our best to be able to convey the thoughts and concerns from all of those who can't take the trip, because the trips are very expensive. They're very long. They're really hard on you to do them. And, we have to send people to do these meetings. So that idea of a voice of the people is really important. And so when we were there in Paris, at the COP, we were able to speak to the attitudes and thoughts and ideas from all of these people that we had met with around the country. And we did one of those, we met, in fact, all over North America. We met with the Assembly of First Nations and in Canada as well, and other places around where we tried to go where there were a lot of gatherings of leaders and other citizens of our nations. This part of having that voice is critical, because we have a lot of supporters. There's a lot of people who support Indigenous rights. There are people who even purport to speak for us, but we have to speak for ourselves. It's really important that we speak for ourselves, because, and this gets into the ideas from our culture and understanding, we have a unique worldview. Ariel talked about this earlier, but that worldview that we bring to this is important, not just for the Indigenous people from North America, but for all over the world. And that idea of being close to nature, that idea of holding those traditional values, one principle that I talk about is the idea of respect. And this has been true from everywhere I go all around the world, that there's a respect for the natural world, a respect for those other beings that we share the world with. And so I like to think about it that there isn't an opposite of respect so much as its lack of respect that's critical. The lack of respect by the other people we're sharing this world with, the lack of respect for the natural world has really caused us to get in this crisis that we're in right now. Because if we truly respected not only ourselves, but the rights of all those other beings that we share this world with, then we wouldn't be doing things that harm the waters where the fish live, or the air for the birds, or that we were doing things that block the night sky, the view of the night sky that's critical to insects and to birds and to human beings, to our own understanding and feeling in the world. As a global society, we wouldn't be doing these things, but as a global society, we are. And I say we are because even this webinar that we're doing right now, we're using electricity. We're not sure where all that electricity comes from. Some of it's going to come from oil, some from nuclear, some from other places. And that power, those are things that help contribute to the problem. So we need to be as respectful as we can. We need to include these things that are important to our cultures. And we talk about what are the kind of things that we bring, what's part of that unique worldview. I want to describe one incident that happened while we were in Katowice in Poland at the COP, and we had been almost 2-year negotiation to establish the facilitative working group that is implementing the local communities and Indigenous Peoples platform of the Paris Accord. And it'd been a long debate. There were a lot of things going on, and we got right down several times. We all thought we were done, and then we weren't. We had to kick it down the road, another meeting. And at this meeting, we were sitting in a room. It's this big square of tables in a room, and the people were sitting at the tables, and the people were sitting on the floors, on the radiators, and all around the room. It's just this huge crowd. And the nation state representatives were in there, and also Indigenous people. There were a lot of us in this room. And what was happening is a couple of the countries were out in the hall, and they were basically verbally duking it out, figuring out the language that was going to either make this successful or was going to break us at this meeting. The tension in the room was really high. And then one of the Indigenous people stood up and sang a song. Then another one sang. Then Andrea, who's going to speak later, she sang a song, and then I sang a song. And one of the women from Malaysia, she took some music and held her iPhone up to the speaker and had somebody hold it there to the microphone, and she did a traditional dance. And as we did this music, the tension in the room came down and came down and came down until it was really pretty relaxed. And meanwhile, the people from the hall, they were out there working away. And eventually they came in and said, well, we solved the problem. Well, they thought they did it. I firmly believe that we did it. We did it by following our traditional values and by thinking about this and in singing songs that praised the environment and each other and all of this, that really contributed. That's a contribution that we make to these. We bring a perspective that helps everybody all those other folks take a pause for a second and think about things. And that's something that we can bring. That's just one example. There's lots of examples, and you'll hear more through the day. I'm looking at the clock over here. I know time's a-flying, and we'd like to have time for people to ask questions. But I wanted to talk about that, and I got one other thing before I'm done. When we talk about our rights, we talk about the rights of Indigenous peoples, human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And those rights are property rights, but under the way the laws are written a lot of places, they appear to be that way in the treaties, and it's treated that way by the courts. But our real rights, if you think about it, and in my case, I'm going to use one example of fish. And my ancestors, when they reserved fishing rights in the treaty, they didn't look at the waters like those behind me in the picture here. They didn't look at them and say, those are our fish out there. they reserved the right to fish. And that meant they reserved the right to sing for the fish, to dance for the fish, to pray for the fish, to catch and eat the fish, but to live with the fish, to have a relationship with the fish. And it's that relationship right. Our rights are truly relationship rights that are important. And when you have that lack of respect in the natural world, it inhibits those relationships. So when we talk about protecting Indigenous rights and human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, it's the right to continue those relationships with the natural world where we can drink the water, we can eat the foods from the lands, and we can catch the fish and eat them. And all of these things are healthy. And we can't do that without having those same things be true for all of the other citizens of the world. That's why Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights are so important to these discussions on climate change and what we're doing over there. And I will reserve the rest some time for questions and answers at the end, and I'll pass it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for grounding us in why it's been so important for us to be there and how our culture, our languages, our songs have really changed the ways in which we even approach these spaces. So thank you so much for that. I'd really like to welcome Andrea, who has been a long-time participant within the UN processes and within the UNFCCC, and has done tremendous work advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples. She's currently the focal point with the facilitated working group for the local communities Indigenous peoples platform, and she has made incredible and important contributions to advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples within these spaces. And I welcome Andrea to walk us through the next sort of history of what we've been doing and where we're kind of at right now.
Thank you very much, Jokwe Utesia. I'm going to see if I can successfully share my screen. Thank you very much. I'm going to start talking about why we're there. And of course, we're there because Indigenous peoples in our prophecies and teachings for many generations have talked about, as Frank said, what would happen if the human family did not find a way to live with respect and harmony for the natural world. We have to pay attention to our own ability to adapt and survive the crisis that we're currently facing. It's not in the future now for many Indigenous peoples. And I wanted to show this. This is an example of many aspects of the way that we approach these discussions on climate change. This is a traditional corn altar from Oaxaca, Mexico. And you'll notice the four sacred colors of corn are represented there: the black, the red, the white, and the yellow. These are also the four sacred colors of the four directions, the four cardinal points, some say, and some even say the four colors of the human family. But this also represents on a very practical level our ability to adapt, because our elders knew and continue to know by the insects, by the phases of the moon, whether it's going to be a dry year or a wet year, a cold year or a hot year. So they always knew in advance what color, what form of biodiversity they needed to plant so that our crops would be healthy and the people would be fed. There were no stores, of course. There was no backup. We had to know. This is Indigenous science, also a picture of our science. And it's also a picture of our rights, because without our right to land, to water, to safeguard our traditional knowledge, to safeguard our traditional biodiversity and our seeds from genetic modification that undermines our ability to adapt, we will not be able to survive. So this holistic understanding is what we bring to the table in these discussions. I'm trying to change. Okay, sorry, I'm not so good at this. Okay, as been mentioned before, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in September 2007. This is a picture of the hall that I took. I had the honor to be there present. The green names are the states that voted in favor. Of course, we know the 4 that voted against. I think everybody here lives in 2 of those states, Canada and the United States, but there was overwhelming support for this recognition of our rights. And this is now the internationally recognized minimum standard. It says in the text itself that this is the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. And what does that mean? That means this is not the ceiling, but it's the floor. And it's a floor that we have to stand on that we didn't have before. And it's a floor that we can take into every negotiation, from the local school board where we live, the municipalities, provinces, and of course, the countries, the nation states, and even the United Nations. The UN Declaration affirms our right to participate in decision-making that in matters that affect us through representatives chosen by ourselves in our own traditional manner. This, of course, is Great Chief Wilton Littlechild from Canada as rapporteur of the UN Permanent Forum. Unfortunately, this right was probably disregarded or not realized in this process on climate change. In fact, I will say that through all my decades of work at the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was one of the worst bodies for our participation. These are just 2 examples of demonstrations that Indigenous peoples had at COP15 and COP16, protesting our lack of ability to have a voice, when already the scientists were saying that Indigenous peoples were the most affected and our rights were not being recognized in any way there. This is COP21, the famous COP21, where the Paris Agreement was adopted. And amazingly enough, Indigenous peoples were not even allowed as Indigenous peoples. You could if you had some kind of credential from a country, but as Indigenous peoples and nations, we were not even allowed into the rooms where the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. This was my counterpart. I was one of the 2 representatives from North America of the global steering committee, and this is at that time Chief Bill Erasmus from Dene Nation. We're leading a chant outside the room, outside the building, where we're saying we are peoples, and our rights have to be recognized. One of the core demands that we had at COP21 is to hold the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above what's called pre-industrial levels, before humans started mucking up the environment with carbon and other greenhouse gases. We were not able to get that. That was stated as the goal in the Paris Agreement, which is legally binding to the states that have adopted it, but they said they could go as high as 2 degrees. And even the scientists have said that 2 degrees increase would have a devastating impact on the ways of life of Indigenous peoples. But in a study that just came out this month, in fact, this IPCC, that the International Panel on Climate Change that Ariel mentioned, the scientists said we're already well on our way. And many of the changes that we're seeing are already irreversible, such as the melting of the polar ice cap, because in the Arctic, it's 3 times the level of increase. And that just has a devastating effect, not only on sea level rise for coastal communities and island communities, but also on the currents in the ocean that affect not just the ocean living creatures, but also the global climate. The United Nations estimates that over 1 million species are facing extinction. This is just one example. It's a Central California salmon run that is an essential part of not just the nutrition, but the culture and the ceremonial life of the Indigenous peoples in California, for example. We've had a much stronger response from the human rights community, it seems, recognizing that climate change affects rights than we have from the people, the states involved in the climate discussions. That's still a battle we're fighting. The Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples said in 2009 that climate change constitutes the single most important threat to global food security. Of course, extreme weather impacts. This is Boricane, also known as Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria, and the massive fires in California. I just was there yesterday, and we flew over some of the biggest forest fires in the Sierra Mountains. Here, this is our family farm in southern Arizona. Last year had the hottest, driest summer ever recorded, and it's already hot and dry here. But one of our big victories, and this was hard fought, I'm telling you, this is one of the worst challenges we've ever had at the UN, was to get rights of Indigenous peoples included in the Paris Agreement. It's in the preamble. The first time an internationally legally binding environmental convention recognized human rights at all, let alone rights of Indigenous peoples. Article 31 of the UN Declaration is one of the rights we focus on, the right to protect, control, and maintain our cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, including our seeds, knowledge of flora and fauna, our own sciences, and others. Article 32, free prior informed consent regarding development, probably one of the biggest disregarded rights around the world by states, by countries in the Declaration. As Frank mentioned, we had a widespread input from Indigenous peoples. Through leadership, it was reported that over 300,000 individuals actually had input into our consultations before we went and to COP21, and 96% affirmed that their own people's traditional knowledge and practices can be useful in responding to climate change. This is Chiliyazi from the Dene Nation. We made a video of elders talking about this, and we played it at the pavilion. Partly as a result of this global input from Indigenous peoples at COP21, operative paragraph 135 of the Paris decision recognizes the knowledge and the need to strengthen the knowledge and practices of Indigenous peoples and established a platform for exchange of knowledge. I want to note to you, it's not just, it doesn't say exchange knowledge with states. It also means to us the opportunity to exchange knowledge among ourselves. And we consulted with our knowledge holders as well as the states in this process. This was a conference we had in Guatemala, one of the traditional knowledge holding women there. And everywhere they said, our rights must be upheld, our knowledge must be respected on an equal basis in order for us to be able to participate in this process. We took those demands in, the rights, the participation and respect for our knowledge into the negotiations. And this is a picture, I think, very unique at the UN of the states and Indigenous peoples celebrating the establishment of what was called and what is called the facilitative working group for this new platform. And one really amazing thing is we got into the COP resolution a recognition of respect in its entirety for the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is the first time in the whole history of the work at the UN of Indigenous peoples since 1977, where Indigenous peoples were able to select our own representatives and sit on an equal basis in a formal UN body with the states. There's 7 Indigenous representatives selected by the regions and 7 state representatives. We keep pushing because UN Declaration calls for all, it says shall, doesn't say should, shall UN bodies and states and agencies shall implement the provisions of the declaration. Part of the challenge is the issue of human rights being integrated into all aspects of the decisions. These are youth protesting at COP25 in 2019, the provisions of what's called Article 6, demanding that right to free, prior, informed consent and rights of Indigenous peoples be respected when they talk about creating these forest offsets, which are very controversial to Indigenous peoples. This also applies to the whole push right now to create protected areas, they call them, many of which are in Indigenous peoples' lands, and Indigenous peoples are not allowed after that to utilize, to hunt, to fish, to gather firewood, or even to live on these lands. So we have a major policy push on that issue. Just really quickly, I know I'm out of time, but we have to look for our own solutions, independent of what the UN and the states and they do. This is Indigenous people sharing seeds, especially drought resisting seeds from US, Mexico, and Guatemala. These are Indigenous peoples at Tohono just right up the road, using and revitalizing their traditional knowledge about how to save rainwater in a desert climate for irrigation. Of course, the most important thing in many ways for us is to ensure in our own nations and peoples that our elders have the opportunity to pass this information on to youth and children. This is finding roots, gathering in Alaska, and how to sing to the plants here in the Sonora Desert. So with that, Chokwe Otesia, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that really, really well-rounded sort of articulation of how Indigenous peoples have really been advancing our issues within these spaces over the last 30 years or more. It's a lot to get into in a 10-minute presentation. So I thank you for taking on that challenge, but we have some other speakers. And I just want to say, what's really powerful about your presentation is it articulates the importance and the ways in which we do things differently, and also the challenges we face. Earlier on, before we came here, we talked about how we're not quite at the level where we want to be. We're at the table right now with the FWG and the local communities Indigenous Peoples platform, but we're not eating the same meal. And the reality is that this criticism of these spaces has existed since it started. Even at the declaration of the first International Forum of Indigenous Peoples on Climate Change in 2000, there was a denouncing of the Kyoto Protocol and how it alienated our right to participate in national and international discussions that directly affect our peoples and territories. And that it really didn't recognize the existence of Indigenous peoples. So the work that Andrea articulated has been critical to advancing us from being an invisible force that was in the background to really being at the front and advancing some really progressive and outside of the colonial box, because I don't want to say it's outside of the box, but outside of the colonial box of what solutions to the crisis can really mean. And our next speaker is Janine Yazzie. And I just love the fact that we have on this call the spectrum of the age of folks that have been participating in these spaces, from Elder Frank to Andrea, who's been doing this for a long time, and Clayton, who will be coming up at the end, but midlife, to Janine, who's like a young woman that is really advancing and continuing this work forward, not just within the UNFCCC spaces, but within multiple spaces within the UN that is critical to feeding into these discussions and discourse. And with that, I'd like to invite Janine to bring us through how Indigenous peoples' rights have been advancing the issues around agriculture, food, sovereignty, and how this is a critical component to advancing climate change issues across the board in a more holistic way.
Absolutely. Thank you. And, there's there wouldn't have been the opportunity to engage in so many spaces if it weren't for the work that has been historically done by organizations like International Indian Treaty Council and others who've been operating in this space. But to work with International Indian Treaty Council, particularly with Andrea, has been such a huge learning curve, because as a community organizer, one of the things that I was able to start off with after the passage of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was really exercising how we use that type of international standard for the implementation of our projects on the ground, centering our traditional lifeways, worldviews, and practices, regardless of whether they were recognized or legitimized by federal or state or domestic policies. And so to take that work across different mechanisms was only possible because we already, as you've heard from the incredible history shared by both Frank and Andrea, we've had our champions there ensuring that they were holding these UN mechanisms accountable to the participation, effective and meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples. And so in that way, I engage with the high-level political forum on the sustainable development goals. My predecessor from IITC, Roberto Pereiro, helped form the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, which is one of 9 recognized major groups that engages with the high-level political forum. And through ongoing work that IITC started around food sovereignty, we're now engaging with the UN Food Systems Summit, which is its own challenge. But across a lot of these mechanisms, one of the things that has really helped us is that the articulation of the rights of Indigenous peoples, as Frank laid out, as something inextricably connected to our ways of being, our worldviews, our prayers, our ceremonies, our songs, all rooted in our own understanding of our connection to Mother Earth, to our ecosystems, and to all sacred life, is really what helps us have the ground that we need to further advance what those rights mean and look like as these countries use these mechanisms to coordinate and facilitate international or global responses to some of our humanity's shared challenges. And so for Indigenous peoples, a lot of the pushing for our own rights to be recognized, as well as our solutions to be centered, is really the push for systematic change and transformational change that is desperately needed, because we cannot create the solutions that are needed within the same mechanisms, mindset, or logic that has created the challenges that we face today. And so one of the things that I think often gets lost, because, working at different levels in advancing Indigenous people's rights, I know there's so many, even of our elected leaders, as well as our movement leaders, that don't recognize the importance of engaging at the international level in these types of mechanisms. And yet I think it's evidence now with the use of standards such as the free, prior, and informed consent, as well as the rights to our lands, territories, and resources, our cultural rights, our educational rights, our rights to form our own governance structures and systems, that is being used by Indigenous movements across the globe, that effectively engaging in these systems to create these standards can create huge opportunities for our work on the ground in our communities to advance meaningful solutions that are effective, that are holistic, and that center who we are and restore who we are as Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things that I think is really important to note is that a lot of our advocates that work on the international level in these mechanisms, the reason why they're so effective is because they're also frontline movement workers. They are directly connected to their communities. There are cultural knowledge holders. There are traditional practitioners, and there are movement organizers that are able to carry the voice of our people and the realities of our lived experiences into those spaces, and do it in a way where they're they're negotiating from a place of strength and not a place of victimhood. And I think that there's a ton that could be learned just from that process alone. And it's extraordinary what has been accomplished throughout these years when we know for a fact that these individuals, these advocates, were not properly resourced. They were not supported and having our welcome to the table. They had to fight for that right. They had to fight for that privilege. And they did it in ways that are very familiar to a lot of our community organizers who have had to share sandwiches on the front line and and get donations for travel money and try to work with one another, skipping meals sometimes so that they could be present and that they could continue to ensure that these people who are negotiating very important agreements are not given an opportunity to ignore the importance of the rights of our people, are not given the opportunity to water down what those rights actually mean. And so one of the things that I think has been a very beautiful thing to witness in particular is just the tenacity of our Indigenous rights advocates that work at that level. To see Andrea work in those spaces is a phenomenal thing. Like the way she can negotiate in the spaces and always hold both the fact that we cannot allow any type of concession that waters down our rights, while also protecting the right of our Indigenous peoples to interpret what that means for themselves, is a very delicate dance, but she does it phenomenally. And as Frank said, I think one of the ways that's able to hold our integrity in those spaces is how we invite our own ceremonies and our own protocols and practices into those spaces. I remember at, and I think we shared a lot of these moments, Ariel, but like in Katowice, when the negotiations on Article 6 were becoming overwhelming, when our youth did a demonstration that got them kicked out from the venue, and there was a lot of stress because we know when we're carrying our voices to those spaces, what's on the line for our people. One of the ways that we're able to really maintain coming from a position of strength was bringing in our medicines to our office space and standing in prayer and sharing those medicines so that we could smudge ourselves off from all of the negative energy that is in those spaces and reground ourselves collectively and what the importance of what we are fighting for. And I think that in that way, it's a beautiful thing when you look at the engagement of Indigenous peoples across these different mechanisms, even though like the CBD, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the High-Level Political Forum on the Sustainable Development Goals, the UNFCCC, and a lot of these other UN mechanisms and just even non-related UN, our international spaces that are not related to the UN, our vision is the same. And our vision is to do what we need to do to protect the rights of our people so that we can restore our respectful and balanced relationship with the earth and the lands that are a part of our identity, and the sacred life that is a part of the legacy and the inheritance of future generations. And in that way, we're able to, by grounding in those worldviews and those traditional values, we're able to really center the solutions that our people have developed, because we're not coming to these spaces as victims. We're coming as movement leaders. We're coming as knowledge holders. We're coming as the next generation of climate leaders that have solutions that are holistic, that are sustainable, that are regenerative, and that form the true response and approach to counter the colonial, capitalist, white supremacist, and exploitative nature of our domestic and global institutions. And I think that, I know we're kind of running late on time, and I want Clayton to have time to speak and also hopefully some time for some question and answers. But that's really one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, is that when we have our knowledge holders in these spaces and when we have our youth in these spaces, spaces, the way they can transform the conversation by sharing their hearts and sharing with the stories and voices from their communities, and a way that we can like collaborate and strategize across our different peoples from around the globe for shared solutions and safeguards for our rights and for our peoples and our communities. I think that shows that even if we're still marginalized in these spaces, we still retain and hold true power. And we have to continue to invest in that power. We have to continue to resource that power and that type of participation, particularly since many of these mechanisms are using the pandemic as a way to limit the participation of non-government actors in these spaces. And so a lot of the advancements that we have made so far is really in a precarious situation right now, as governments try to use these types of restrictions and particularly around travel and around in-person meetings to continue to develop spaces for these types of negotiation, but without our people involved in it and participating in the actual mechanisms of decision making. And so I hope that we can, through this type of engagement, increase awareness about how important it is for us to have our voices and to be engaged and to learn about the history of engagement so that we can engage effectively and build off the progress that has been made, but also so that people can be more aware that we have to fight now harder than ever to continue to ensure that we advance and build off the progress that has been made in protection of our people and our communities, because we don't have any more time left for full solutions.
Wow, thank you so much, Janine. That was such a great articulation of the importance, not just of participating, but of our knowledge holders participating, of how when we participate in these spaces, it's not just about like going with, Western colonial white education, but bringing our people that are doing the work on the front lines, that are holding our cultures, our values. Those are the important messages. Those are the important voices within these spaces. And we need them to continue to be there. And that's such a really important thing, because sometimes folks are just like, oh, well, I don't know anything about UN policy. Why should I participate or pay attention? And the reality is our culture, our knowledge is that we have carried for centuries, our millennia, are critical to this discourse. From the way that Frank talked about how it grounds us when we have our conversations, how those songs bring us back down so that we can move forward and advance, to Andrea's articulation of our needs to continue to push through in these spaces and advocate for our rights and advance things forward, no matter how hard it might seem, to Janine bringing us into this conversation around the importance of community voice in these spaces. We've done so much, such a tremendous amount of work over the last 40 years of the UNFCCC's work, and we still have a lot of work to do. And so our last speaker is Clayton Thomas Mueller, and I really wanted him to talk about the power of storytelling and the narrative of Indigenous participation and those connections to human rights and why it's been so important. And as someone who has participated in many COPs over the years, and I also have given him a challenge, since, ICA is operating in so-called Canada, that we have an election coming up, a snap election in our country. Like, where are we going with this movement right now? And how can we ensure that the power of Indigenous storytelling and our traditional ways of transmission of knowledge are uplifted in these spaces?
Thanks so much, Ariel. You're doing an awesome job moderating, as always. Thank you for holding the basket, and thank you, ICA, for all the work that you do. Before I jump into it, and I'll try and be as brief as possible so we can get to questions. I do just want to acknowledge Andrea and the International Indian Treaty Council. I'm a child of IITC, and so many of us that continue to organize, over the decades, and all the ones that are coming up and the ones that have already made their journey have come through and been touched by the International Indian Treaty Council. And, when I was a boy, I found old documents from IITC. This is when fax machines, this is before the internet. And I had this vision of a United Nations of Indian people, like all these Indians in suits and, you know, like all decked out. And I actually moved to San Francisco from Winnipeg, where I'm talking to you all from, to try and go work for ITC. I ended up working for their sister organization, Indigenous Environmental Network, but you know, certainly got to be trained and travel this journey with a lot of incredible Indigenous leaders. So yeah, but I just want to acknowledge Andrea, especially in her leadership, somebody that I'm very inspired by. So yeah, the United Nations, gosh, what a crazy thing. You know, there's all these different instruments, and you know, whether it's the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, mechanisms within, you know, various instruments, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But as mentioned by all the speakers, as Indigenous nations, as sovereign nations with the right to self-determination, we still have no seat at that table. And we continue to have to work through our allies, intermediaries with settler colonial state governments like the United States and Canada, where I live, and you know, other places as well. Indigenous peoples living in those places continue to have to deal you know, with settler colonial powers determining what language that those nations are putting forward get to be in the final implementation text of whatever UN instrument it is, UNFCCC included. And this is really important because with the Paris Climate Accord, the Paris Climate Agreement, you know, the largest diplomatic meeting of governments in the history of humankind to try and deal with the failures of the Kyoto Protocol and come up with some kind of plan to deal with the existential crisis of the climate emergency. You know, big business, big oil, the fossil fuel sector, you know, big carbon emitting sectors of the economies of the planet continue to hold a lot of sway, and you know, have actually found ways to collaborate with global institutions like the World Bank, like the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, and other regional financial institutions to somehow monetize the response to climate change, to make it profitable. And you and me are not going to be players in that market. You know, Shell and BP and, you know, all of these big climate criminals and the governments that they're colluding with are the ones who are going to be playing in that false solutions market that the previous speaker spoke about. And you know, this topic of false solutions is something I think that Indigenous peoples have and continue to champion. You know, we continue, as Ariel mentioned in her opening monologue, that, you know, we utilize a large percentage of the surface of the earth, and in doing so, you know, try to do that post-colonialism in the most respectful manner according to original instructions. You know, a lot of people, they talk about human rights, they talk about Indigenous rights. And you know, my good friend from up in Alaska, former Chief Yvonne Peter, he always says, you know, yeah, we all talk about rights that we have, but, you know, we really should be talking about our sacred responsibility and responsibilities, plural, and, you know, period. And so I think, you know, over the years, you know, there has been a drumbeat, a powerful drumbeat, and, you know, rippling through sacred water, and led by, you know, the rise of the sacred feminine, you know, and in these global mobilizations that tend to happen around these UN framework conventions on climate change, it's Indigenous women who are leading these marches, you know, and I think that there's a message that is being brought to the world by the leadership that exists in Indigenous nations, particularly coming from Indigenous women. And you know, and that's why these big gatherings are really important, because not only is there an inside strategy to go through the tedious task of trying to influence colonizers to do right by us and to do the right thing, and to, you know, put the most strongest recommendations of our language into the operational text of these treaties, and to, you know, go against big business as far as like, the trade agreement agenda that they have, because the Paris Climate Accord is essentially a trade agreement that commodifies the Earth's atmospheric carbon cycling capacity and turns it into a garbage dump, who basically the highest bidder can pollute in there and continue to expand, say, the fossil fuel sector. I think that these, I tend to think about, I think a lot of us who do international work, we get a lot of really good constructive feedback from frontline activists who, are living in the bush and defending the forests, and, and who say, well, what's the UN good for? What's it all about? And, I tend to think about the work that's being happened at the UNFCCC, kind of like maybe how our ancestors were thinking about the gunboat diplomacy that they had to deal with when they were negotiating the treaties with the British Crown. They knew that they were right, and they knew that they had creator-given rights, inherent rights, inalienable rights to the land, water, and climate, and that they had to protect those things, that those rights came with responsibilities to future generations. And I do believe that the essential work that happens within UN instruments led by Indigenous peoples is in a framework that doesn't exist within Western perceptions of time. And, in the Cree way, it's funny, people say, oh, those Crees, they think in 7 generations, 7 generations ahead, every decision. But that's actually not that accurate. We do think in 7 generations, but it's always thinking about the 3 generations previous, the generation that we are currently living in, and the impacts of our choices on the next 3 generations, learning from our past, preparing in our present to defend our collective future. And that's where I think it's absolutely essential, the inside strategy, and that as sovereign nations with the right to self-determination, that, if only we're just shouting out and counting coup on our enemies that continue to try and encroach on our lands for massive extractive industries, at least we get to do that. And I think the movement benefits that come from Indigenous participation within these UN instruments is that we get a chance as Indigenous peoples to come together, and as our elder Frank talked about, to share our ceremonies and to bring some sacredness into a very, very depressing space, and to lighten it up with the light of our ancestors and their love and care. And, and we get a chance to scheme together, globally. And, with the rise of the digitalization era and our ability through, communication platforms and the democratization of funding through, things like PayPal and GoFundMe, and, the democratization of media through, the rise of, digital storytelling and Indigenous new media forms. There is a compounding scale in terms of the impact of our voice, of our message, and the fact that we no longer need white intermediaries or corporate media to get our word out. And we've demonstrated that, especially since Copenhagen, through Paris, and now to Glasgow. Indigenous peoples and our digital assets that we utilize when we go and organize, civil disobedience in whatever country it's happening in, and we collaborate and share stories and, share our struggle. We're able to convey the beauty and ceremony that's woven throughout those acts of peaceful resistance. And I think it's something that the world really needs right now, And this new age of storytelling, I believe that it really went through the roof, right to the stars with Standing Rock. Indigenous peoples built a $2.7 million media apparatus to get out to the world what was happening in Standing Rock, and that was all Native run. And they were blowing the corporate and colonial media out of the water as far as views on their social media content on a planetary scale. Tens of millions of people tuned into Standing Rock, all to see Native storytelling, digital story-based strategy. And it moved the world. It really tipped, I believe, the support, especially amongst young people, of Indigenous people's social movement. And we saw that here in Canada, pre-COVID shutdown. 20 months ago when the Wet'suwet'en Nation, the women of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, put a call out to shut down Canada. And you know who responded? All these youth who are participating in the climate justice movement. And you know what? They shut down Canada for 2 weeks. You know, and it was only because of the COVID pandemic that all those acts of resistance had to come to an end. But you know, the fact of the matter is that this is reminiscent of other social movement good practice in the past. If you think back to the civil rights movement in the United States, you know, and Dr. Martin Luther King and all those frontline community leaders walking over that bridge in Selma, Alabama, getting their heads beaten by the police state, you know, just for asking to end racial segregation. And, you know, it wasn't until the children came to the front line that the shift in the Overton window of what was possible began. And at least on paper, you know, racial segregation ended in the United States on a policy level. And, you know, when Greta Thunberg, the little Swedish climate striker youth leader, came to Canada from Sweden on September 27th, a little over a year ago, you know, there were over 1 million children that marched, you know, here in Canada alone, 500,000 in Montreal, 20,000 right here in my own city. And, you know, I went to the march with my sons, Felix and Jackson, and it was a very powerful thing. 7 million children across Mother Earth marched that day. And there's another climate strike that's coming, and we're going to see a massive pressure to be placed on Canada, who is the only economy that signed on to the Paris Climate Accord, whose emissions are still rising. And it's because of the Canadian tar sands and its associated pipeline infrastructure. And, you know, as Ariel mentioned, we're right in the middle of a snap election. On September 20th, Canada goes to vote. And you have to remember, when our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, got elected, you know, he went to the United Nations and he proclaimed that Canada was back. And months later, with taxpayers' money, he nationalized the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, you know, which would double the size of extraction in tar sands, you know, which is one of the few carbon bombs on the planet. Any individual one of each were to be developed, it would fundamentally change the chemistry of the planet and end our ability as humankind and all of our relatives as well to live on Mother Earth as we have been, you know, since Creator put us here. And so these are very urgent times. And, you know, I think that these UN frameworks are part of a much bigger and sophisticated multi-pronged social movement strategy to build the world's largest social movement that humankind has ever seen. And, you know, we need that right now. And it needs to be grounded in love and hope. And I think that's where the young people come in. And, you know, because, you know, it's not just the existential threat of the climate emergency that we're dealing with, but it's a triple threat. You know, it's economic recession on a global scale that we've never seen before. It's the COVID pandemic and whatever mutations come from that, and the anti-democratic strategies that you know, settler colonial state governments are utilizing the COVID pandemic to suppress our ability, whether marginalized or not, to participate in democratic processes, to come up with strategies that localize power in the interest of globalizing justice. And that is the part I'll leave you off on. You know, the solution to climate change, you know, fundamentally, and at the end of the day, is in localizing power in the interest of globalizing justice, and, you know, redesigning our vision of our economies in a bioregional way that asserts our role within the sacred circle of life, rather than an entity that is existing outside of it, dominating it and controlling it.
Thank you so much, Clayton. And I think that what Clayton's articulations are really demonstrating is the fact that there is incredible stuff that is happening in these international spaces where Indigenous rights are being advanced by, you know, organizations like the International Indian Treaty Council, Indigenous Environmental Network, along with our international allies from all over the globe. In every single country, there are Indigenous organizations that are doing similar work that the North American organizations like these two, ICA is entering into this forum. We're trying to step in and advance and support Indigenous folks within these spaces as well. We're new kids on the block by we're not at the level of IITC by any stretch of the imagination, but we're really trying to advance this and bring to light the fact that these happenings, these storytellings, our participation is critical, but it's also critical to connect the dots from the international level to the domestic level. If we are not ensuring that we're holding our colonial governments to account for the incredible work of our Indigenous brothers and sisters at the international level, we are missing opportunities not just to advance our rights domestically, but to support an international movement of Indigenous peoples advocating for our sovereignty, self-determination, and our rights to free, prior, and informed consent, and advocating for the importance of our voice, our culture, our languages, and our rights within these spaces. It is such an incredible amount of work and journey that many of the presenters have spoke about. And I'm just so honored to have been able to bring you all and invite you into this discourse. We are going to have another session in a couple weeks, just before, in the lead up to the COP26, to really talk about what's happening at this upcoming COP. What are the major themes? What are the major issues? How are we going to come in and really start to talk about the nuts and bolts of this COP? Because every single COP comes with its own unique challenges and core issues and themes. And that's okay, it's okay. But we also need to collaborate. What are our inside strategies? How do we advance the agenda inside these colonial spaces? What are our outside strategies? How do we advance to ensure that the media hears our stories from the outside, which has been a core part of what Indigenous peoples movements have done since the beginning, from the Carioca Declaration that happened outside of it, to the protests, the mobilizations that happened outside of the COPs, and the civil society mobilizations. The story of Indigenous peoples is one of changing the narrative inside these colonial structures, while simultaneously growing the civil society movement to assert that we have our own unique ways and processes of advancing our issues that are not included within what I refer to as the colonial box. So we must continue to move forward and together. And as we're supposed to be wrapping this up, but I'm going to, challenge you all with some questions here, because there've been a really interesting question around transformative governance models built upon Indigenous ideologies. How do we move beyond just talking about advancing our rights to including our Indigenous rights within these spaces? And I know Andrea has been really heavily involved in all of this within the FWG and the local communities Indigenous platforms around how we go from being Indigenous rights are important to how do we actually embody them within these spaces. So I don't know if some folks want to talk about that, their own experiences within these spaces. How are we advancing those rights and safeguarding them, knowing that they are outside of that colonial box? I challenge you, Andrea.
Oh yeah, I'm hearing that you're challenging me. Part of the reason that the UN Declaration took 30 years to get adopted is because one of the hard lines that we had was the use of the term Indigenous peoples. And that S on peoples, the states had all kinds of different options. The US came up one time with persons belonging to Indigenous groups, Indigenous populations, Indigenous communities, vulnerable groups, etc. The right of self-determination under international law is a right for all peoples. It means we have the right, now that we are finally recognized through the UN Declaration as peoples. It says the right to freely determine our political status and freely pursue our economic, social, and cultural development, which means the right to define for ourselves what development is, taking into account our culture and our societies, as well as our economic development, which includes our food sovereignty, etc. So I think it's important for us to uphold those structures on the level of our nations, because our governments are equal under the treaties to the settler governments. And that's a constant challenge. We know the United Nations is an organization of the colonial governments. And it's in a way, it's amazing that we've been able to make the progress we've made there. They certainly, wanted us in the room, but presence is not the same as participation. Presence in the room is different. And we fought, tooth and nail, clawing our way through this process. And I really appreciate, Clayton's comment that one of the things that came out of the international work that the UN had nothing to do with except creating spaces where we could come together is an international Indigenous peoples movement. That we can back each other up and support each other in bodies such as the UNFCCC. But the most important thing is the exercise of our sovereignty on the ground. Our traditional governments, our treaty nations need to continue to assert that right. And there is always such a temptation of being sucked into the colonial process. Yes, we have to interface with it, but that's the treaty relationship. There's treaty partners, and we have to take that relationship that IITC was founded on in 1974, the right, and not just the right, but the responsibility we have as nations, many of whom have treaties that recognize that equal nationhood with the settler governments, take that into our work at the United Nations and never give that up. There's a strong push to make us give it up, but we can't give it up.
Yeah, on that note, I'd love to, Janine, you've worked on and Frank, you've worked on when we talk about integrating and participating, there needs to be safeguards. So you want to talk about some of the work you guys have done on safeguards?
Well, I think I'll go first here. One of the things that came up in my mind is that as sovereigns, one of the key, you're either sovereign or you aren't. There's no partial sovereignty or limited sovereignty. If you're sovereign, you're fully sovereign. However, the negotiation of the acceptance of your sovereignty with the other sovereigns around you is a principal duty of a sovereign. So that's negotiating with the tribe next door over land, over the exercise of different things. It's negotiating on the world stage with the acceptance of that. Nation states are negotiating the exercise of their sovereignty with each other all the time, constantly. But we have to be doing that same thing, so that when we're in the process of not just getting to the table, but demanding to see the menu and wanting to eat the same food as we've talked about on here, the point is that we have to negotiate. We have to demand those things. And that's part of that negotiation of the acceptance of our sovereignty. It's really critical that we as Indigenous peoples do those things. So sometimes it seems really simple, like just being at the table or at a meeting, making sure we're there. But other times it's getting the right language in. And sometimes you can't get it all at once. Sometimes you have to be willing to accept incremental progress, as tough as that is for us. Incremental progress is progress, and we have to find ways to do that. So I'll turn this over now to Janine.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of thoughts on this. I'll try to keep it brief. But I think I'm seeing some of the comments both on the live stream as well as here in the Q&A about the issue with participating and these types of colonial institutions and the understanding that this legitimizes them. And I want to push back against that a little bit. Our participation does not legitimize these institutions. They continue to legitimize themselves, and they're going to continue to do what they want to do, whether we are there and what we do is we make it harder for them when we advocate for our rights as Indigenous peoples and for the safeguard of our rights, to ensure that whatever direction is taken, we still stand upon this practice that Frank is talking about of exercising our own rights as sovereign nations. And I think that when we are talking about what these transformative models of governments look like, one of the things that, to kind of speak to what's being said about participating in colonial institutions is like the exercising and implementation of these rights doesn't have to be limited to how governments act. We take these rights and we use them in almost every aspect of our work at the community level, from the reestablishing and reviving traditional food system practices and protecting those food systems through policy, but also through community organizing structures. Looking at what do those decision-making processes look like that center and uphold our worldview when we're operating from that place of honoring and restoring our traditional values, our traditional priorities as Indigenous peoples, and building the vision that we see for our future generations. That takes that creates a process for developing our own protocols on our own terms that can help guide our actions, and whether it's movement organizing, whether it's building a community garden, but even in larger projects when it comes to us re-articulating and reimagining what it means to take care of our natural resources. And all of that can serve as a foundation that people that can help us stand in our own power as Indigenous peoples without really limiting the possibilities to our engagement with government systems. Because the reality is that here in the United States, a lot of our own tribal governments were set up for us, and they were not ratified, they were not created by us, they do not honor our traditional matrilineal societies, they do not honor the ways that our peoples have historically taken care of and lived in balance with our lands and our ecosystems. They do not honor our uphold many times. Our own visions for our communities and for ourselves are the pathways for regenerative economies that are more in line with our worldviews and who we are as Indigenous peoples. And so there's this challenge that we face in both trying to ensure that we are advancing our rights in a way that creates stronger and more effective protections from the ongoing threats to our lands, our territories, our resources, and particularly in regards to our waters. But there's also this responsibility we have to exercise what those rights actually look like for our peoples, for the futures that we envision for our nations, and to apply that to all of our activities and all of our actions across the board, so that we're restoring our ways of governance, not just through traditional like Western understandings of what governance looks like or what legitimate governance looks like, but in a way that actually helps us restore and center and nurture the solutions that our people need.
Thank you so much. And I think like that's a really important point, because we are not participating to legitimize the UN. We are participating to legitimize our sovereignty and autonomy as Indigenous peoples and our rights to advance like our solutions from the ground up. What are those things that drive our communities, and what has driven our communities to protect and advocate for those that can't speak, from the winged ones to the four-legged, to the plants and the medicine, to the ones that swim, to the air and the mountains and the lands. Like, we are advancing for our relatives that do not have those voices, those responsibilities. And, I know Clayton has been a really big part of this movement, that it's like participating in colonial structures is not as legitimizing these structures, but we are advancing our sovereignty and autonomy, and that needs to be articulated really, really clearly. We're not going there to like get a pat on the back for colonial governments to tell us good job. We're going there to say, you're doing this wrong and you've excluded us for so long, and we're here to assert like our sovereignty, our solutions, and it's time you listen. And so I know I'd love to give Clayton some opportunity to wrap us up in this conversation on like your perspectives on like why we should be participating.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was two parts, going back to the original question, which was related, about local economies and, what's the best practice. Well, there really isn't any best practice, and a lot of the talks I do have to remind people that are participating and sharing that Native people are not a monolith, we're not a page in a textbook, we're as diverse as China to Poland. And, it's really important to understand that diversity. And I think what it comes down to is exactly what Andrea was talking about, which is that, Indigenous peoples have the right to sovereignty and self-determination. And, if utilized properly, our original instructions will guide us into a bioregional economic, social, and political model that makes sense, not just for our nations, but for the ecosystem that we're responsible to take care of. Now, that said, I really have to be adamant about, and just kind of like be like, yes, about what Andrea said, as far as the temptations that our people are facing, not just here in Canada, but across the Mother Earth. A lot of our nations are cash poor. I mean, we're not poor. We're not living in poverty. We're rich. I think we're the richest, of the humankind there is on the planet because of our connection to the sacredness of our lands where Creator put us. But yeah, there's a lot of socioeconomic challenges that Indigenous peoples continue to face, and the temptations of the extractive industries, be it mining or oil and gas or tar sands here in Canada. It continues to be a big challenge because, again, we're just like any other group. We've got people that are really into capitalism, and maybe they might be kind of greedy and maybe a touch evil. White folks have those evil people too, and so there's probably some evil Black people out there too. I mean, so we're dealing with those things in-house as well. And so it's just got to be bioregionally designed. I think governments need to step out of the way and actually invest at a post-World War II scale in a redesign and revisioning of a new economic paradigm that's in full partnership with Indigenous peoples and that uplifts the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the floor. That's where you start. We can go even further than that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Clayton. I think this
Ariel,
is really.
could I just make one last comment?
Sure,
I just want to say that
it.
I started working at the International Indian Treaty Council as a student intern when I was in college, working on the issue of forced sterilization as a policy of the US government. But Bill Wapipa, the famous late great Bill Wapipa, Sac and Fox and Kickapoo, was my first teacher and trainer. And he told me years before I ever went to the United Nations, he said, Andy, the hardest thing, he used to call me Andy, right? Only person ever called me Andy. Andy, the hardest thing is to go to the United Nations and stay Indian. And that is so profound in so many ways. Back then it was east-west, now it's north-south, and, a lot of these things, for the carbon trading and all of these kinds of things. And that's why what people talked about is taking our traditional understandings and the story that we know from the grassroots, remember who we represent and what they have told us. Our elders, our young people. I used to come back from the negotiations at the UN Declaration and look at my little granddaughter who was born. I had one child and two grandkids born during my involvement of that process. And look at her and say, oh my God, is she going to grow up and read this and says, Grandma, you agreed to this? This is crap. I mean, it was like, so much pressure on us, but I think that's the thing to remember, is to continue, be who you are there. No one can take that from you or make you do it different. You have to give that up. And we hold together, we strengthen each other, we strategize. But the most important message for me in my decades at the UN is stay who you are when you're there. Tell the story you know, tell the truth you know, in the most honest way you can. And look how much we've done. We'll continue to prevail. We have to on this issue. This is life and death.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you so much to all of the speakers today. We will be having another session on September 17th, and we'll be looking at how does the COP work? What are the big issues leading up to the COP26, and like where Indigenous peoples are. So there is the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, or the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, and how folks can engage with the COP in person and virtually. So we'll be walking through ways that folks can participate and support these movements as Indigenous peoples travel to Glasgow. Honestly, at this point, it's very precarious, but we're all still planning with the ongoing pandemic. Who knows right now, but we are still planning to move forward. And we're really excited for the continued participation and moving forward within these spaces. I do have a 3-minute video, and I know we're way over time at this point by like 15 minutes, but it's such a beautiful video, and it's from the wrap up from the marches. And the reason I really wanted to show it is that within the marches and these spaces, it's really the place that we hear from our people that aren't getting accredited, which we'll talk about next time, because accreditation and participation is really difficult for our folks. And a lot of folks come, and the only way they can participate is on the outside. And this is like their message of interviews we did with folks in Madrid at the COP25, from the big mobilization on the streets of folks that were feeling really, really challenged by these spaces. So I'm going to share this video, and we'll talk to you all next time on September 17th. So with that, I'm going to go like this. Press play.
We are one with the earth, with the sky, with the sea, with the sun. We are one. For Indigenous people, Unuhit, the notion that we are one is a simple truth that has guided our life in ways that has sustained us since the beginning of time. We value the sacred knowledge of the earth that has been passed down to us through the generations, knowledge that can bring us the healing the world so desperately needs in this time. As we face the most critical challenge of our time, climate change, we urge all peoples to shift their relationships with the earth and with each other.
As Indigenous youth, we are in the front lines of climate change, and we are also in the front lines of fighting it. Indigenous rights are imperative to climate justice because climate change is the result of colonialism. My ancestors were the original climate activists, beginning at first contact with our resistance to the desecration of our sacred lands and sacred waters. For hundreds of years since colonization, we have been saying that this way, this colonial way of relating to our lands from a point of extraction, from a point of taking without reciprocity, without giving back, is flawed, and it will drive us to destruction. And now we are on the precipice of global collapse. We as Indigenous youth are calling on global leaders to do better. We've sacrificed everything for our lands. We've fought, we have died, we have had our children taken away from our homes because of these lands. And we are calling you to fulfill your responsibilities. Because it's not just about protecting our livelihoods, it's about the livelihoods of your children and your future generations, and our ability to live on this sacred land.
Y actualmente hay 33,000 personas que están en riesgo de perderlo todo por el levantamiento del nivel del mar. Nosotros no consumimos combustibles fósiles y a pesar de ello somos los que más vamos a sufrir. Somos los que más sufrimos por el cambio climático. Estamos a punto de perder nuestra lengua, nuestra tierra, nuestra tradición, por la forma en la que viven en las ciudades. Así que tenemos que dejar estas palabras vacías, estas palabras de los gobernantes que no están haciendo nada, porque necesitamos acción ya. Necesitamos acción ya por las mujeres, por los niños, por la comunidad LGBT, por todos, por los pueblos indígenas.
So that is like literally one of my favorite presentations or videos that was produced out of the COP, because it's just such a beautiful articulation of the urgency that our communities feel and the importance that we come to these spaces with. And that is what drives our communities, is our connection, our love for our culture, our communities, and our homes. It's also what drives the speakers on this call to continue to put themselves in the line of fire and show up in these spaces and advance and advocate for our communities. We need all of our communities, from those that are fighting at home on the ground, to those that are fighting at the national levels, to those that are entering into the international forums. And we need to work together to create one of the largest social movements, the Indigenous climate justice movement, and advance this so that we can address not just the climate crisis, but the human rights crisis and the Indigenous rights crisis that has been a part of this entire crisis together. And we have that opportunity, and I'm so grateful and honored to be working alongside such incredible folks. And thank you so much, Masicho, Hi, Hawa. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Mamapi.
Thank you.